Hi, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's ThinkIn. I'm Alexi Mostrous, an editor and partner at Seedrs, and I have to start off by saying thank you to Huawei, who have helped us to put on this discussion, which I have to say has proved controversial from the outset. I spoke to a couple of panelists before this event, and they quite properly questioned the very premise of this topic, which is small business, big problem, are UK SMEs falling behind? And it seems, at least from a kind of layman's perspective, that it's quite a complex picture. There was a report written by McKinsey, I think, in 2020, which found that SMEs were hit really hard by COVID in Britain. 80% said their revenues were declining. And that's not counting all the disruption caused by Brexit. Having said that, there's also quite a lot of evidence that SMEs have bounced back significantly post-COVID. But whatever the answer, it remains a very relevant question to discuss today, simply because of the power and weight of the SME economy, which I don't think is very widely appreciated. I didn't know that 99% of all businesses in Britain fell into the SME category. So asking what government, banks and others can do to bolster and encourage SME growth, especially post-COVID, seems an incredibly relevant question to ask. And to answer it, or to help us answer it, we've got four panelists who kind of really are the best in the business when it comes to this sector. Emma Jones, founder of Enterprise Nation. Jeff Lynn, CEO and founder of Seedrs, Martin McTague, Policy and Advocacy Chair of the Federation of Small Businesses, and last but not least, in front of his daughter's climbing wall, Simon Mead, CEO of Cambridge Wireless. You know, it is interesting that we should have representatives on the panel who can speak both to kind of the tech industry and the entrepreneurial side of SMEs, and also the established businesses as well, because it just goes to show that this isn't a easily defined or narrow category, and maybe that requires different solutions or different thought processes, and we'll get into that as well. And the last thing to say before we kick off is that although the panel are esteemed speakers, we do not want this to be a top-down panel event. We want to encourage participation. So if any of you in the audience have opinions, questions, points of view, if you're running a small business and you want to kind of come onto the chat and tell us where you think the challenges are, please do so. We'd love to hear from you. In fact, that's the kind of the raison d'etre of a ThinkIn, to hear from as many people as possible. So my colleague Ella is manning the chat. So just type your comments in the chat or raise your yellow hand. Is it a yellow hand or a blue hand? I don't know these days, but raise a digital or a physical hand and we'll kind of try and bring you into this conversation. And hopefully by the end, we'll reach a kind of more sophisticated understanding of this complex topic. Why don't we start though, before we look at the challenges and the potential solutions to this, why don't we start with the premise of the discussion? Emma Jones, you have helped countless numbers of SMEs over the years, both pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, pre-COVID and post-COVID. How do you see the British SME landscape at the moment? Is there any evidence that SMEs in Britain are falling behind their European counterparts?
Far from it. So I was one of the ones who did disagree with the premise of this event. And in fact, your colleague, Alexi, Sebastian, wrote to me and said, would you come and speak? And I said, I'll come and speak because I totally disagree with what you're saying. So I think you should retitle this Small Business, Big Opportunity. And I did kind of reply to Sebastian and say kind of the picture that's painted is not one that we see at Enterprise Nation. And of course, that's not to say that small businesses haven't had a tough time. All businesses have had a tough time over the past 18 months. But the position that small businesses are in now is a pretty confident one, and dare I say, quite bullish. So we are a platform business. We seek to connect small businesses to the support they're looking for. So every day we can see what is the type of support that small businesses want. And the number one item that they're looking for at the moment is, how do I make sales? So dare I say, those businesses who have done well over the past 18 months, the ones that quickly pivoted online, the ones who are selling the right products in the right kind of way, who've done pretty well, they want to continue with those sales. Online sellers now want to meet their customers in person, so they want to test physical retail. Small businesses are getting more ambitious about selling to bigger clients, so they're thinking, how do I get into retail? How do I export? How do I sell to the government? So we're seeing that there's a lot of small business confidence out there. And the one thing I would say, Alexi, in terms of and it was a brilliant introduction to the event today. I love the kind of high impact music and, it's there to kind of stir discussion. I think one thing we have to be a little bit careful of with small businesses is kind of all of this narrative of they're not as productive and they lag behind other European small businesses and they're not as good as big businesses. Is I think we have to be really careful not to admonish small businesses and kind of tell them off like they're little children. People who start businesses, in my mind, we should respect every single one of them because they've kind of taken a passion, they're going to turn it into a way of making a living. That comes with inherent risk in it. They're giving up comfortable salaries, they're working all hours, so they could be kind of sacrificing some family life. So I think they should garner our respect. And of course, they need support to sell more, produce more, keep happier teams, employ more, export more. I'm not questioning that. There's always more that small businesses can do and that they want to do. But what I think we exist for, certainly this is Enterprise Nation, I know Martin is the same at FSB, we exist to support them, to highlight the areas in which their business needs support and then to make sure they get it. But I think kind of, moving our finger around and kind of saying, oh, they're terrible because they're not productive is probably not the most motivating way to encourage a business.
And I think I completely agree with that. But isn't it two questions? It's one, what is the attitude that we should be taking to small businesses, which effectively I think you're saying should be encouraging rather than admonishing. But if you look at the kind of the factual matrix, even before we get to that, is there evidence that there is a productivity problem amongst SMEs?
So productivity there is, and it's called the productivity puzzle. It's been going on for years. So Charlie Mayfield started to look at it. An organisation called Be the Business was set up to address this. And in fact, the government is acting on this. So this is one thing where the government has taken on board policy. They're launching a programme called Help to Grow Digital. There is a lot of this in the narrative that says small businesses would be more productive if they onboarded digital skills and technologies into their business. Help to Grow Digital is aimed to address that. It's going to give £5,000 in vouchers to small businesses. It goes live in a couple of weeks. Maybe we'll come on to talk about kind of the role for policyholders, because I was pretty disappointed to hear that particular programme, it was due to go live with 3 categories of software. So small businesses would get £5,000 to spend in 3 categories of software. They were due to be CRM, e-commerce and accounting software. We've now heard that it's going live without the e-commerce category because not enough vendors came forward who want to sell their e-commerce software, which I find amazing. We are kind of talking to somebody at the business department about this tomorrow to try and say, how can we get more e-commerce brands like Shopify, Squarespace, Wix and Weebly to kind of take part in this program? Because what it comes down to, in my view, is the more sales that a small business makes, the more productive they will become, because sales brings growth, and growth ultimately forces you to become more productive as a business. We've seen this ourselves at Enterprise Nation. As we scaled the business, as we took on more people, we had to adopt processes, bring in digital technologies, bring in experienced people who could help us become more productive, because we simply couldn't manage the growth if we weren't productive. So I think we have to look at this from a different way. Yes, there is a productivity puzzle, but let's help small businesses make more sales and grow, and then rest assured they will figure out how to become productive.
Can you just, Emma, before we move on to the other panelists, can you just help me kind of square this circle between the McKinsey survey? I'm not sure if you're aware of it, in 2020, taken at the height of the COVID pandemic, 80% of the SMEs that were surveyed said that their income their revenues were falling and that they were incredibly pessimistic about where they were. And then you fast forward a year later or so, and actually, all credit to them, the situation seems to have kind of been really, really turned around. And lots of them, and it's not just you saying, it's the surveys that I'm reading as well, the confidence is kind of up again. So how has that happened? And has it only happened to a kind of a proportion of them? Just explain that transition.
Yeah, well, so welcome to the resilience and the adaptive nature of small businesses. So we saw this at Close Hand at Enterprise Nation, that first phase of lockdown. Of course, every small business owner panicked. They were losing their staff. They were figuring out which schemes for which they were eligible. So it was a very tense time. Then, of course, they did what they did best, or what they still do best. They adapted very quickly. So the huge appetite we had from small businesses pretty much from kind of May and June of 2020 was, how can you help me become a digitally and financially fitter business? So what small businesses pretty much in the main have spent 15 to 16 months doing is sorting their finances, building themselves a digital business. So if they had physical premises, they're now omni-channel businesses, so they can sell in multiple ways. And Alexi, I was talking about this to somebody this morning. The biggest thing that small businesses have kind of captured in terms of coming through this experience is mental resilience. So I did a interview with BBC this morning around small business response to today's mandatory mask requirement. And the question from BBC was, how are small businesses feeling? And I knew this question was coming, so I went to speak to some small business retailers yesterday, and I said, how are you feeling? Everyone's got to wear masks from tomorrow. How are you responding? And the response I got from them is, A, we've been through this before, so we're ready, we're resilient, we know what to do. And secondly, as long as our trade isn't being cut off, so this is still customers being encouraged into store, it's just to do so in a safe way, we feel ready and quite pragmatic about accepting the reality of the situation we're in. So this is the thing, small businesses adapted very quickly. And this is where I say, let's be really careful not to wag our fingers at them, because they have been through hell in the past 18 months, as indeed of businesses of all sizes. And I think coming out of it, as I say, they are feeling bullish, they want to make sales, and they want support on how to grow their business. And I think coming on to kind of government roles, there's an element of cheerleading that government can do to encourage that confidence in small businesses, as well as the more practical things that government can do, like making sure we do have e-commerce as a category when Help to Grow Digital goes live.
Thank you so much for that. That's a brilliant kind of setting out of the foundational issues. Let's go, if we could, to Martin, who potentially might have quite a similar perspective to Emma. But can you just pick up on Emma's point, Martin, about the danger of people wagging their fingers at small businesses? I mean, do you think who is wagging their fingers at small businesses and not appreciating them as they should?
No, I think Emma's right, that there is a tendency to be a bit sort of patronising. And
amongst who? Sorry, amongst government?
Well, against quite a bit of the commentariat and
Right.
and also government ministers. If I had £1 for every time I was told that small business was the backbone of the British economy, I'd be a rich man. But it's converting it into something practical is often the problem. But where I maybe slightly disagree with Emma is, because there's an optimism bias in anybody who starts a business, there is inevitably, me included, a tendency to look on the bright side. You then respond to any kind of survey in a very positive and an upbeat way. However, when we've drilled down into exactly what people are going to do, it's not quite so clear, right? So you say to them, well, are you investing in training your people? No. Are you planning to buy any new equipment? No. Are you going to take on a new foreign market? No. So why is that sort of that confidence not converting into a lot more proactive work? And I think a lot of it's because of the volatility and the risk they see at the moment. It's very difficult to try and predict where this is going. I mean, this Omicron, saga is just the latest one, isn't it? It seems that once you seem to be getting into some relatively smooth water, then another problem comes along. And government has made all sorts of efforts to try and change people's behavior, make them more productive. But one thing that came out of that McKinsey report that struck me was that apparently only 2% of all the money spent on business support actually converts into anybody changing their behavior. It is absolutely pitiful. 98% of it is spent, has no impact on anybody's behavior. And, over the years, the biggest problem has been that, you know, a lot of small business owners are fairly unsophisticated when it comes to finance. You know, they rely almost entirely on debt from the big four. And there's a good 40 to 50% who are happy non-borrowers. You know, they will just grow at the whatever rate they can get as a sort of growing from within their own resources. But, you know, people investing in their businesses to try and grow rapidly and to become more productive is still a minority sport. There's still a lot of people out there who see this as that's not what they're in business for. They're mostly in business because they want more freedom. They want to control their own lives. They don't want to be answerable to some big corporate machine. And therefore, they're not in the game of trying to rapidly grow their businesses. And that has to be recognized as well.
And I suppose my question to that, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the 98% figure I'd never heard before, but how much of a problem is that? Because you could say a lot of people just want to have their own business for all the reasons that you raised, not necessarily to kind of invest or to train or to make foreign investments or anything like that. And that isn't that like a perfectly kind of justifiable objective?
Well, I think it's a perfectly reasonable way of going about, you know, of running your life and deciding how you want to look after yourself and your family. Why not? You know, but I think if you take something like Help to Grow, which, you know, Emma's rightly pointed to as being a really good initiative from government, the bit about management is sort of predicated on the idea that the reason we've got poor growth in small businesses is because we're poorly led. You know, small businesses are poorly led, they're not managed properly, and so they need training. So the government's come up with this bright idea of saying, let's have 12 weeks on a sort of a university course. Well, you know, anybody that's ever met the average small business person, and I'm sure Emma will agree with this, they're not exactly overburdened with time. And are they going to commit to 12 weeks worth of training when they're not even sure what their productive outcome is? So that's a classic example of good intentions actually not really delivering much in the way of change.
That's really, really interesting. Well, I mean, just going back to the 98% point, 98% of all money spent on business support has no impact on anyone's behavior, is what I think you said.
That's right. Yeah.
Given that, you know, given that it is justifiable for quite a lot of businesses not to want to change their behavior if they're doing it for lifestyle reasons or whatever, like how much of that 98% is actually a problem? Like, what would you like the figure to be?
Well, I think the biggest problem is, you know, and anybody who's in business knows you've got to segment your market, right? So, you know, all 6 million businesses out there, small businesses, are not identical. They've all got different needs, different objectives. They are structured in different ways. And yet there's this sort of bland approach that somehow every business is exactly the same. And if you put out a uniform offer, they will all come rushing for that offer. And the reality is, because they're so poorly targeted, that won't happen.
I mean, I think Liesl McDonald, who we might want to bring in a second in the chat, is making exactly this point, that SMEs are not a homogenous group. Let's bring her in a moment before turning to Jeff and to Simon. But Martin, just one follow-up point on that. Do you have a sense, or does your group have a sense of how government or policymakers should segment the SME sector?
Yeah, I think so. And again, you know, that McKinsey report was very good at doing that. It actually broke them down. You know, you imagine somebody who's, I don't know, you know, a graduate, a university graduate working in their back bedroom, a consultant on biosciences or something, right? And compare that with a guy who's running a metal bashing business with, say, 200 employees. You know, how can they be compared as a business? And therefore, what will appeal to that one consultant, graduate consultant, who's thinking about how they can develop their business and is probably worried about IP and so on? how does that compare with, say, the guy who's got a metal bashing business? And you can't appeal to them in the same way. So that, McKinsey laid out quite, I've forgotten what they called them, like personalities or something, right? They laid out some quite interesting categories of self-employed or small business owners. And I think you could do a lot worse than following their model.
Okay, let's bring Liesl in very briefly before we turn to Jeff. Liesl, are you around?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Hey, do you want to make your point?
Yeah, my point was exactly as has just been expressed, that SMEs are such a diverse group with such a different set of goals and ambitions and needs. And I think that a lot of the interventions by both the private sector in the form of venture capitalists and banks, and then also government interventions are a little, as we would say in Scotland, maybe harum-scarum. And therefore, there's a lot of money spent, which could probably be spent on interventions with startups, small businesses, growing businesses, which would have much better outcomes if they were targeted better, exactly as the previous speaker was saying. It's not about spending more, it's about being smarter and listening more and understanding more about the modern marketplace, and getting excited about the fact that there are different groups with different needs. And if you can find that and tap into that, there's a huge potential in SMEs, I believe. I'm an investor. I invest in small businesses, female-founded and minority-founded businesses. I advise them. I'm a non-exec director in several companies, and I've definitely found that there is huge potential, which is very exciting. But a lot of the interventions by the private and the public sector are frustrating.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, well, let's come to Jeff now, who is kind of, as someone who kind of has pioneered equity crowdfunding, and I think has done kind of significantly more than 1,000 deals and works with tech startups. And do you see yourself working in the SME space? Is that a term you recognize?
Yeah, look. First of all, I mean, I think we are all in violent agreement here that the SME space is very far from homogenous, and it covers, a hugely wide range of different types of businesses. And the businesses we work with, broadly speaking, are equity fundable businesses. And does that, that doesn't necessarily mean they are supercharged growth tech startups, although some of them are, but they're all businesses that are seeking to grow very substantially. And not every SME is is that, and not every SME should be. As Martin said, I think a number of people set up businesses for personal and lifestyle reasons, and that's fantastic. And there is no better or worse type of SME. But I would say that yes, the businesses we work with, I think very much are an important part of the SME ecosystem. I think that, those that are starting small, but don't necessarily always want to be small, they're SMEs today, but would love to be FTSE 100 companies tomorrow, are a critical component of the ecosystem. And I would say, getting back to the initial question of the sort of premise of this talk, I am very much loath to disagree with anything Emma says. Emma has been one of the great catalysts and contributors to the entrepreneurial ecosystem and enterprise in the UK for well over a decade. So if I'm disagreeing with her, I'm always slightly concerned I've got something wrong. But I probably have more enthusiasm for this premise than maybe she does, because I think certainly on the end of the types of businesses that I work with, it's not doom and gloom, but I have concerns. I think the environment we're in, I don't know that COVID has necessarily driven much of it, but Brexit and a lot of the mood music around Brexit, not necessarily specifically the departure from the European Union, a lot of the music around Brexit, I think, has led to a somewhat more inward, somewhat less pro-tech, somewhat less pro-international expansion mood in government, and in the commentariat, about small businesses, and that concerns me. I mean, I think whatever else one may say and whatever one may think of the coalition government in the first part of last decade, they were very good at promoting Britain as a center for startups and a center for growing businesses. And they had absolutely no hesitation to get on a plane to anywhere in the world and scream about how amazing Britain was at building these kinds of businesses. And that sort of thing has a habit of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say it enough, people begin to believe you. And a lot of the capital we saw flowing in from international venture funds and underlying LPs, a lot of the attention that started to get paid to the UK startup ecosystem, I think can be credited in part to that. Obviously, the substance was really there. It's not that was created out of nowhere, but the noise made around it, I think, was very good. We're in a very different time now, and I feel like we're much less, as a country, much less almost proud to talk about the great tech businesses we're building. Much less sort of excited about it, and I think that has a potentially negative set of repercussions and reverberations, throughout the ecosystem. So I do have my concerns about where we are.
Thank you. It raises a couple of points. I suppose the most immediate one is, maybe we're less proud of talking about our great tech businesses because overall, many more substantial questions are being raised about big tech and about the operations of big tech than they were when the coalition government was around. And do you agree that potentially at least some of those questions are legitimate?
No, look, that is an absolutely true statement, that there are a lot more questions about certain of the practices of big tech today than there were years ago. But I don't necessarily know that the two necessarily connect directly. I mean, I think that, many of the issues that, I think, we have a public policy concern with today, are very specific to the incredibly large tech monopolies that are almost uniformly based in California, and they don't, and I say that, in the sense that they don't even apply to sort of, simple multi-billion-dollar companies. They really were talking about 5, 6, 7. Platforms that have an overwhelming dominance in our daily lives, and whatever the issues are there, and there are very legitimate ones. I think they can be addressed while at the same time celebrating the amazing work that businesses, from your sort of humble unicorns all the way down to your earliest stage startups, are doing the work they're doing, and without those 2 points being inconsistent.
I want to bring in a couple of people in a second, Andrew Girdwood maybe, and Carol Bell, who both of whom are making really interesting points in the chat. But Jeff, just one question, one follow-up question. It surprised me that you were less optimistic and more concerned potentially than Emma, because I would have thought that the companies that you worked with were quite kind of self-selecting in terms of their efficiencies, that they were the sort of companies that wouldn't be falling behind in terms of digitalization or training. They would be kind of savvy enough to be relatively cutting edge. And yet you're more concerned about the climate than the wider sectoral analysis.
Yeah, I think my concern has less to do with productivity than it does with prospects for growth, and these things are also quite relative. I mean, in terms of productivity, no, you're right. I mean, businesses we work with, tend to be run by digital natives. The concerns that both Emma and Martin have discussed around, bringing people, giving small business owners the tools and the knowledge to be able to incorporate these efficiencies into their business. Very important points, ones that tend not to affect the businesses we work with. But on the flip side, I think, many of our businesses do work in, while at the same time that their ambition and the scale that they can achieve is a great thing, it also tends to mean that there are a lot of other people working in those spaces and, in other countries and, in other verticals. And so, part of success, for the British startup is being able to access the capital and the talent and the regulatory environment necessary to be able to outperform competitors. I think we're doing amazing things. I think, and we see amazing businesses being built, and obviously every investor talks up her own portfolio. But I mean, I love the businesses that Seedrs has invested in. Many others that we've missed out on are doing amazing things. But in terms of relative success, and in terms of what we see, here versus in countries where I think there's a little bit more positivity, I think there's an amber flag. I'm not, I say not doom and gloom, but I do think there's an amber flag.
You've got concerns. Okay. Let's bring in Carol Bell, if Carol is around.
Yes, hi.
Hey, Carol. I think that you've got a point of view from Wales. Is that right?
Well, certainly, yes. I'm one of the non-executive directors on the board of Development Bank of Wales, and I chair its investment committee. So we're there to serve the SME community in Wales, and I completely agree with the point that Emma made right at the beginning about the degree of confidence that we've seen. Certainly, there have been sectors where it's been incredibly difficult, like the hospitality sector. But really, even in that post-Brexit to pre-COVID timeframe, none of our companies were sitting on their hands. They weren't waiting to see how the investment climate would turn out. They had the confidence to push their businesses forward, and we're there not only to give them capital, but we're there to give them help as well, in a very practical sense, through a stable of non-executive directors, if that's the right collective noun for non-executive directors. We have people who have maybe sold their own business and are willing to go back in and help another SME to grow, as it were. So it's creating the right ecosystem really can help build that confidence.
But presumably, Carol, I mean, like you've had Brexit, and you can't underestimate the challenges that both Brexit and COVID have caused to SMEs, and presumably for every SME that that has adapted positively and that's pivoted and has almost kind of come out stronger, there have been ones that have either cut back or even closed down.
It's not a one-to-one correlation in my experience. I mean, there are sectors that are very, very badly hit, but we've also heard about how people have adapted digitally, and we ourselves as a bank, we're an SME actually in some ways, in the sense that we've got less than 250 employees. What we did immediately on the first lockdown, everybody went home to their back bedrooms and their studies, and we had to deploy 100 million on behalf of the Welsh government into the SME sector very, very sharply. And we managed to do that because we had invested in digital technology, fortunately, ahead of time. And our CEO had the vision to divide our executive team into 7 groups so that we could literally run a sausage machine to process the applications that we got for that 100 million, and we closed the fund inside a week. So I think that's an example of SME resilience from the bank down, really.
Absolutely, it sounds like exactly that. But I mean, on this 100 million, it's interesting to kind of take that figure and to put to you the point made by Martin, which was that 98% of this kind of business support, presumably, something that the 100 million falls, a category that the 100 million falls into. Do you recognize his point that the majority of that money didn't really have any impact on any business's behavior?
I don't think I'd agree with that. I think it gave people time to think and to create resilience. And let's not underestimate as well the fact that the furlough schemes were running in to help businesses that were really having to wind down their staff costs quite dramatically because they couldn't function. So I think the two things together did make a difference.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's come to Simon Mead now, and then maybe we can bring in Andrew Girdwood. Simon, can you just explain a bit about what Cambridge Wireless does, and you potentially pick up some reactions to the conversation that you've heard as so far?
Yeah, sure. So Cambridge Wireless is a R&D kind of members association based in Cambridge. So we've got all of those kind of Cambridge tech companies and members, plus increasingly now more and more companies from across the UK. And so actually a large portion of those are startups and small businesses, and that's where I feel fairly interested in this subject and feel we've got something to contribute here. And the first thing I would say, I think the comments about, if we can take the COVID grants out of it. My dog's about to bark. I'm so sorry. So if we can take, it's all live.
Your salamander.
Yeah. if we can take those grants out of it, because I think they were there and you'd be daft not to take them if you could. I don't think in all my time, and I have been involved in probably 4 startups, a couple of them have been really successful, a couple of them have, one didn't and one thing, but I don't think at any point, and I don't think I've ever met an entrepreneur that's leapt in the air and said, well, there's another government initiative to give me a grant to do something.
Right.
Now I think that speaks volumes for the way that an entrepreneur thinks. And I think without wanting to shoot your premise down again and agree with everybody else, but I particularly agree with Emma on this, that actually entrepreneurs are incredibly resilient folk. They're really strong-minded people. And actually, if we were directing support, it would be towards working on the entrepreneur as opposed to telling them what to do with their business.
Just break that down in terms of like what that means practically. How should government support change from one to the other?
Well, I'm not saying the government should support the change.
Right. So what do you want to happen to support entrepreneurs going forward?
Yeah, so what I would say is that entrepreneurs are, they work in a very specific way, they think in a very specific way, and they look for opportunities that their own kind of mindset skills are able to exploit, and that's what they do. Now, if that happens to mean actually there's a grant or there's a product that the government or local government or whoever it is offering can help me, they'll take it. But other than that, it may not come on their radar. And so when we talk about outcomes, I'm always very nervous about measuring things on the outcomes. We look at the outcomes and say, well, the outcomes are this. So if we put these things in, the outcome should be X. That's what it should be. But that never seems to work, and we end up looking at the outcomes and then skewing the initial investment, even if that was the right thing to do in the first place. And I think what we don't realise is that most entrepreneurs will go through 4 or 5 businesses at least before they find the one that hits. So to me, it's about an investment in the entrepreneur and that person as an individual that could probably be the most effective. And I think that comes through, it comes through networking. It comes through the people that they know. It comes through making things easy for them to find, but not necessarily, it's about, for me, it's about removing barriers for people as opposed to, giving them money here and there. I mean, everyone loves the money, but it's quite hard to get. And we've been involved in all sorts of grant programs and things over the years. And it's quite hard to give the money away. We don't make it easy to get that money, that government money. There are hoops to jump through. And an entrepreneur, I think, might well think, I'd rather be selling stuff than filling out a piece of, a 20-page, 50-page grant form.
I can see that Martin's got his yellow hand raised, so I'll come to him in a second, and then we'll go back to Emma to talk about some things that can be kind of categorized as solutions, although that might not be quite the right word. But Simon, I just want you to pick up on Liesel's point in the chat, where she says, where public money is concerned, outcomes are important, part of governance. They just need to be sensible. I don't think that you'd probably disagree with that, but can you just kind of flesh out a little bit more what you mean by we shouldn't focus on outcomes?
I think what I'm saying is that I worry sometimes that if we just measure outcomes, I don't disagree with what Liesl said. I don't disagree. I think that there has to be accountability. But I think my point is that if we just focus on the outcomes, if we just look at what comes out of the system, we end up skewing future support. And I think that's sometimes to the detriment of the entrepreneur. I think that fits the sausage factory type approach, as opposed to somebody who's kind of free thinking and ambitious and has to constantly change and pivot. And if I take us, CW, as a business, we are known for running physical events. That's what we do. But 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we had to make an enormous change. We had to change that, and we had to flip really, really quickly. And we're a small business. We had to think of different ways of connecting our small companies with our larger ones. Building accelerators, building networks, we built a private 5G network. We took some real risks to do it, and that's what it takes. But I don't think I don't think I looked to the government for support to do that. You know, we made a case and we built it and we did it. So that's what I mean. I think it's hard to solely focus on outcomes. Doesn't take into account the nature and the ambitious nature of most entrepreneurs.
Okay, let's turn to Martin. I can see that a couple of people are making the point in the chat, including my colleague Tessa Murray, that there may be a distinction between entrepreneurs and business owners, at least in terms of how SME directors see themselves. But sorry, you wanted to respond to Simon's point, Martin?
No, it was really to reinforce a point that if you go back to the 08-09 crash, you know, the last big recession, then 90% of the jobs created after that recession were created by small businesses. So, you know, if you're going to get any kind of recovery from what has hit us with COVID, then it will depend on the ingenuity, the innovative behavior of small business owners. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that they're going to make the difference. And, you know, I think there is a distinction between, you know, grants and loans, which was the response, or a large scale of the response to COVID, and the sort of business support schemes that proliferate, especially from the likes of Bayes. You know, they generally do not generate changes in behaviour, and that's where government get it wrong.
Emma, do you want to pick up on this this issue of what do you think the government can do in terms of encouraging and bolstering SME performance?
I would love to. And actually, just one thing in response to Jeff. And so I should say, and Alexi, I know I started that at the beginning saying I kind of didn't agree with the title, because I think small businesses are not a big problem. I think small businesses are a great opportunity. What I'm not saying is that I'm not nervous about government engagement with small businesses at the moment. So there are a whole level of points where we are very keen to see government re-engage with small businesses to understand them more. It was interesting, and I literally had a call yesterday from someone who runs one of the big technology companies, and the reason he called me yesterday, which I've never had before in the many years we've been supporting small businesses, is of course these huge platforms exist as great businesses, but they also support thousands of smaller sellers who sell via their platforms. And the gentleman who runs Northern Europe for one of these big companies called me up and said, we're a bit worried about the CMA at the moment. So there's some narrative in the UK around big companies either acquiring or merging with smaller ones, that it's starting to get more difficult for them to do that. And therefore, this executive from a technology company said it may encourage us not to look at M&A activity in the UK if the CMA go forward with these regulations. So that makes you nervous. The narrative around...
Just explain why would a barrier to a major platform being able to carry out M&A affect the chances of a small business?
Because if you're a big company and you're looking at potential acquisition, you tend to invest in that business first. So kind of what they're developing might be a bit risky. So you kind of look to invest in them, you kind of build up your stake, potentially with a view to future acquisition. What the UK is currently talking about will almost put off that investment first off, because if they make the acquisition process more difficult, why put the investment in the first place when that's how you see your exit? So that's concerning. Similarly, there is, and I think this is a bit of a narrative that we've had across this call, is when government, from a political perspective, they feel they have to be seen to be taxing the big technology companies. There is talk of a digital sales tax. That makes us very nervous, because if you put a digital sales tax on one of the big platforms, an unintended consequence of that is it's going to be passed down to thousands of small businesses selling on that platform. So definitely I'm with Jeff on, I also agree, I'm amber light at the moment on government relations with small business. In fact, I'm seeing Martin tonight to have a drink with him to hopefully discuss how we can work together to kind of really get that environment again where, dare I say, and I know it's a very sort of pictorial point, but where the doors of number 10 are just opened up every day to entrepreneurs, to small businesses, where representation is very strong, because that's the way in which government will understand the lives of these business owners. But Alexi, as a very final comment on the solutions, everyone who said, the effectiveness of business support, similar to Martin, we'd penned a piece a couple of years ago based on National Audit Office statistics that showed, again, most of government spend on business support is not effective because it's not measured and no one really knows the outcomes from it. But this is exactly why Enterprise Nation exists. So we're building a platform to essentially small business need, because one of the issues for small businesses is they don't know which bit of their business needs support. So in a way, you have to assess need up front, so help the business understand the bit of the business that would most benefit from support, then connect them to the support that is most relevant for that particular need, and then hopefully make sure that that's such a good experience that small businesses keep coming back for support. So I think that's the way in which we address this, is to deliver personalized business support journeys. So you can almost go to the business and say, if you're a food and drink business based in the northwest of England and you access this kind of support, it's going to have this kind of impact on your business. And if you can share that vision, absolutely a small business will activate that support and hopefully change behavior. So I think using technology to deliver that personalized support, as I say, is something that kind of gets us out of bed every day, because that's kind of why we exist.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. I've just got one point to pick up on you, and then maybe we can come back to the other panelists and to Andrew, who I think has been waiting patiently in the chat, which is how the government should treat and how the government should tax big tech companies in a way that doesn't have an impact on the smaller businesses that kind of rely on them. I mean, Andrew has said in the chat that when Google and Facebook got hit with the digital services tax in the UK, they simply forwarded the cost on to the advertisers and SMEs had to pay. And I think Jeff has some concerns, which maybe we can talk about in a second, about the online safety bill. But I mean, there is an argument, isn't there, Emma, that some of these measures are designed, at least in principle, to protect SME businesses, physical shops on the high streets. And I wonder whether you had a view on whether the government could efficiently tax these big tech companies in a way that protected SMEs.
Well, first of all, so these platform businesses, and we're a huge believer in this, they protect small businesses because they've enabled lots of people to start businesses. And just on the physical retail piece, we have previously worked with Amazon to deliver a campaign where we opened up physical shops and we filled those physical shops with online sellers. We're still doing it now. So we think it's not e-commerce or shops. And this is, the distinction is made is kind of government is saying, right, let's tax online sellers because physical shops have to pay business rates. But it's not as straightforward as that. The economy is a very complex and fluid thing. And what we're seeing businesses who do well at the moment, they are this word omni-channel. They're really good at physical retail. They're really good at online retail. And indeed, our advice to small businesses is do both. Trade on a platform like Amazon, test physical retail to see if it can work for you through doing a pop-up. They are absolutely complementary. But in terms of tax, in terms of how do you tax big companies in a way that's conducive, that doesn't harm small businesses operating on them, I would say the UK government should work with the OECD, which is underway, and therefore have this kind of international agreement. But at the moment, kind of the UK narrative of we'll follow the international agreement, but we will also look to see if we can tax the likes of these big platforms is not helpful for the platforms in terms of their own investment in the UK. But as I say, it's definitely not helpful for the thousands of businesses who rely on those platforms to generate their own livelihoods.
And you're on that point, are you in disagreement with someone like Lynn, who is now the head of the FTC, but wrote this quite seminal paper on how Amazon was abusing its antitrust position to the detriment of third-party sellers often that come onto its platform? Are you worried that the more SMEs that rely on these platforms, the more power that they have and the more potential for abuse you're creating?
So we have worked with Amazon for 5 years in the UK, and the one thing I'll say is I have huge respect for their business because I have studied that company, and the one thing that they obsess over is their customers. And so if you look at it from the Amazon perspective, they obsess over giving the greatest selection at the most convenience, at the best prices for their customers. Then you look at the Amazon sellers, the third-party sellers, the small businesses selling on the platform. When Amazon is so focused on delivering the best thing for the customer, that can get in the way of their relationships with the sellers, because they turn to their sellers and say, right, we want you to deliver the best goods at the right prices with the best convenience. And therefore, that's kind of their focus. But we, again, in 18 months, we've run a program for Amazon called the Amazon Small Business Accelerator. We've trained thousands of businesses on how to build their business on Amazon. Our advice to those businesses is use marketplaces that give you access to thousands of customers in the UK and overseas, but don't 100% depend on them. Build your own website presence, start your own customer engagement. And as I say, and I can't hone this point enough, the businesses that have come out from COVID feeling fitter are those who de-risk their business. They sell well online, they sell well offline, they have their own customer engagement, they sell through marketplaces. Those businesses that have that kind of approach, they're strong in all areas, and therefore if one of those areas goes down, they don't collapse as a business, they can rely on the others.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Emma. Jeff, can you just talk to me about your concerns, if you have any, about the online safety bill and the impact that is potentially going to have on SMEs?
Yeah, absolutely. So the online harms bill, for those who don't know, is a piece of legislation that's been in the works for several years now, and on the face of it is trying to do some things that I think most decent and reasonable people, would find admirable. I mean, we're trying to address some of the deplorable and terribly unacceptable content that gets served to kids and others in a variety of contexts. And so, this is one of those areas where, the spirit of it, I think everybody's in agreement with. But I think I think it's also a classic example, and we've seen this multiple times through the years, with things like copyright protection and other areas where, a piece of legislation that is drafted with a view to controlling and limiting what happens on big tech platforms actually is going to wind up putting significantly more power and resource in the hands of big tech platforms, and do so to the detriment of SMEs. And I think there are two particular concerns that I have in the context of the online harms bill. One is that by effectively making one of the sort of overarching themes within the legislation is around user generated content, and the age-old debate as to whether the platform is responsible for what users say when using it. And I think the more responsibility you put on the platform for curating discussion, the more you put, you may be thinking that you are sort of imposing a burden on these tech platforms and requiring them to constrain activity, but actually you're hugely empowering the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world to decide what is and isn't acceptable speech. And obviously, this is been an issue that's played out in the US, it's played out here, it's played out elsewhere. The bigger concern from an SME perspective, though, is that these kinds of regulations, these kinds of burdens take resource to comply with. And, the reality is that the Facebooks and the Googles of the world have fleets and fleets of lawyers and compliance people who can very easily adapt to whatever regulation comes through. The person trying to start the new type of social media platform or a new content platform that has user contributions and doesn't have those lawyers, doesn't have those kinds of resources, can very easily find their business crushed by these kinds of regulations. And I am particularly concerned that a number of the things being mooted within the context of the online harms bill will make it substantially more difficult for small businesses to operate and innovate, and as a result, effectively entrench the positions of big tech. And as I say, this is a concern about a particular piece of legislation that's coming through now, but it is emblematic of something that we see year in, year out, with legislation that's often well-intended, that's often meant in some ways to at least level the playing field, if not favor SMEs, but actually works greatly to the disadvantage of SMEs.
But without getting too much into the weeds of this, my understanding was that the online harms bill, online safety bill, did distinguish between, is it called Category 1 services, which apply to these massive players like Facebook and YouTube, and they impose on them obligations that aren't imposed on smaller companies.
Yeah, well, look, as you say, this can very much get into the weeds. There are distinctions. Things have gotten better in that regard, in the sense that I think a few years ago, when we'd have these conversations, it was, these were often one size fits all policies, and I think we're getting better in certain regards here. But there is still the potential for anybody who is building a platform that hosts user generated content, and that is a lot of different types of platforms. We're not just talking about sort of pure social media plays. That is, I've worked with a business that is, of all things, an online platform to help unions organize, and they find, and they look at at the regulations coming through, and find that they're potentially going to be subject to a very significant set of burdens, notwithstanding that they're a small grassroots sort of organization. So there are serious issues here. There are serious problems here. The devil will be in the detail, and I'm not saying that the legislation itself is irredeemable, but it raises a number of the kinds of concerns that we've seen from these sorts of policies, many times through the years.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to Andrew Girdwood, who's been patiently waiting.
Hey, there you go.
Hey,
so
what do you think of the discussion so far?
Oh, absolutely thrilling, and really, as usual, such an intelligent collection of speakers and thoughts. I started this thinking how frustrated I was that I really enjoy working from SMEs, but I very rarely get to. Because as a sort of technology marketing consultant, two evils, we often just decline business from SMEs when they come in. And we do so because they're a nightmare, absolute nightmare to work with, but justifiably so, because everything is a mortgage risking bet for them. So there's absolutely every reason to ask 105 questions about every decision and then not do it. And I think that is the problem. I much prefer working with a marketing manager or a tech consultant who will happily sign off on a gamble and go home comfortable to his secure mortgage ring. He'll get a different job if it doesn't work out. That, I think, is the thing that the SMEs have as a strength and as a weakness.
Can you fix that in any meaningful sense, or will that always be a kind of like inherent problem?
I think it's inherent unless you've got extraordinarily generous government. And if you look to Europe, there are some. I was in the Netherlands, I think Amsterdam, when a lot of the businesses that I'm working with, who were attracting, a very high figure investment courtiers flirting with Silicon Valley, was still in warehouses that they had just walked into and taken as their own because they'd been abandoned for long enough, and therefore they were legally allowed to do so. One of them had a tree growing through the roof. It become a feature, not a liability. So there's definitely things we can do. But I imagine it's going to be an ongoing.
That's great. I'd like to go and see that warehouse. Let's leave the last word to Simon, who I think had his hand up before. Simon Mead.
Yeah, so the point I was going to make, and I think it relates to something we were talking about a few conversations about. I think what entrepreneurs value is a level playing field above everything, and I think we then went into the conversation about the various different platforms and taxation and things like this. And I think so. I think if the government could do anything, we're very lucky in this country, and we're very lucky across the most of Europe and the US, and that we have stable governments and we have a set of rules that we all broadly play by, and I think that works fantastically well for us. So broadly, we know where we are. I think where government and government grants and intervention really has an impact is on things that aren't necessarily economically viable for people to do themselves. So if we take the introduction of 5G, everybody knows about 5G for the individual. You see Kevin Bacon telling you about it all the time. But what 5G can do for businesses, for example, is something that's quite a difficult story to get across. And you may not necessarily investigate that as an SME. So, the government have got a campaign running at the moment where they've put a lot of money into showing how 5G can improve your business, and it can improve your workplace, and it can improve productivity. Now, you couldn't do that as an individual, but I think for the government to take those types of kind of financial commitments and do those types of things, I think is incredibly useful and probably one of the most supportive approaches that they can make to SMEs.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists. I mean, I personally went from working for the Times, which is sort of about 300 years old, to working for a media startup and an SME, now at Tortoise it's both more stressful and much more exciting. And we, like other SMEs, are kind of feeling pretty good coming out of COVID. So I'm really encouraged that seems to be the trend and the path that we're on. But this discussion has raised so many interesting and various issues, it's almost impossible to pull them together. So I won't even try. I'll just say thank you very much to Jeff, to Martin, to Simon, and to Emma, and to everyone in the chat, to Andrew, to Carol, to Liesl, and everyone who contributed. It was a fascinating discussion, and let's have more going forward. And thanks to Huawei for helping us put it on. Okay, have a lovely day.